የተከበሩ አፈ ጉባኤ፣ የተከበራችሁ የሕዝብ ተወካዮች ምክር ቤት አባላት፣ የተከበራችሁ የሀገራችን ሕዝቦች፣ ጥሪ የተደረገላችሁ እንግዶች፣ ክቡራትና ክቡራን።
Hello everyone, welcome to MD Media's weekly show, the H panel. Today we have a new series we are starting today, Auditing the 2018 Promise of Reform. And we'll be looking at the same promise of reform from different lenses. Today we chose to start with, it's my great pleasure to have Sket Gabisa, Burbridge, and today joined by a new panelist, Zariun Tashoma. Tashoma is known in the media, in the political analysis landscape of Ethiopia. And welcome, Zariun, to the H panel.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great. So today we will, as usual, start with what stood out for each one of you. And we'll start with the scale and continue with Dirk, and then Zariun will time in the third panelist. Scale, what stood out for you over the past 7 days?
Nothing in particular, but something interesting happened over the last 2 weeks. Now, what stood out for me in this week is that the big guns have been silenced in the northern front of the Ethiopian civil war, but reignited in the southern front. So the entire Ethiopian security apparatus, the military arsenal, have been shifted to Oromia, targeting the Oromo Liberation Army. And the drones that pulverized Tigray for now about a year and a half, and in particular the last 3 months, are now indiscriminately dropping their very expensive bombs on human targets in Oromia, with staggering casualties in the hundreds and escalating every day. There was another bombing today, there was bombing yesterday. It's a daily occurrence. What is different is that the drones, usually not military man, but drones are usually for fixed targets, for artillery pieces, tanks, and probably fortresses or things like that. But it's been deployed in Oromia since then. So there is something utterly baffling about the way the Prosperity Party officials think. It seems to me that Homo sapiens' highest evolutionary asset, the brain, is of no use to them. One of the things that I learned in studying human societies for some time now, especially in the post-Enlightenment world, is that progress is a desirable state that has improved the human condition. So when there is a momentum for progress, in this case for peace, one would think that one would build on the momentum to achieve more peace, more sustainable peace. What I mean is that after the Pretoria Accords, the Prosperity Party you would think that the Prosperity Party would keep the momentum of peacemaking and use its experience gained in the negotiations with the TPLF to settle the political problems that have given rise to conflict in Oromia. But that's not what is happening. Asked about the possibility of a negotiated end of the civil war in Oromia, the Prime Minister said in Parliament, maybe about a week or about 10 days ago, he said that the OLA is an organization without a cause. It's bereft of cohesive leadership and is bent only on killing and looting people and has no desire for a negotiated settlement of political differences, which means basically from the top ruling out any possibility of keeping the momentum of peace going. And surprisingly, the leader of the main loyal opposition, the Izema party, who happens to be the Minister of Education in the Prime Minister's cabinet, repeated the same theme and asserted that the only solution to the Oromo problem or the OLA problem is the military solution. You would think that political differences, or military solution to political differences would be the last resort. But here, they're not even interested in talking about peacemaking. And thirdly, the spokesperson of the Oromia government also held a press conference in which he went on a lengthy diatribe depicting the OLA as a leaderless and rudderless entity, a bunch of bandits who are also bent on looting and killing, and there is no solution to any negotiated solution to settling the conflict through a negotiated means. The only solution is to wipe them out. What is surprising to me, what is baffling to me, is that we have heard this kind of talk before with regard to the TPLF or the Tigray Defense Forces and with regard to the OLA a number of times. They have made these pronouncements that the OLA would be wiped out in a month, in 2 weeks, in 3 weeks, that they have been repeating it for the last 3 years. But after 1 million people dead, more than 1 million people dead in the Tigray war, the country was destroyed, the social fabric frayed, and Ethiopian diplomacy completely dismissed, and having a hallowed military, ending the war through a negotiated means in the Tigray case only resulted in going back to the status quo ante. 3 years ago, we have said this is a meaningless war, and that it was a meaningless war. A meaningless war that it was shown by the fact that all of this death, dislocation, mayhem, disruption, destruction, it just ended in a peace agreement or a cessation of hostilities agreement that just had a promise of going back to the status quo ante. Now, taken together, now it appears the Prosperity Party and its allies actually seem to enjoy the civil war. They want the civil war, perhaps until they have implemented their agenda of restoration of the old imperial system that had been defunct for 50 years. So we all know that this is unlikely to happen in Ethiopia. What is certain to happen is the bloodshedding, the political bloodshedding that started in 1960 in the Green Salon in the palace is now going to continue in the green luscious of the Oromia region. The bloodletting is likely to continue in the largest region, in the most populous region of the country.
Thank you, Pascal. And let me bring Duke here.
Sure.
Okay, Duke, what was the highlight for you over the past weeks?
Well, I'm usually focused on the humanitarian aspect in Tigray, and what stood out was the last distribution update, which is already controversial. It shows that in the eastern zone and central zones, every district has either received food to be distributed or has begun distributing food. Now, that is not necessarily the case. What I'm hearing, what USAID is saying, that the central zone remains very difficult. The news reports seem to very clearly indicate that there are still huge areas of Tigray that are not accessible to humanitarian distribution. This And so it's difficult to tell exactly what's happening with the humanitarian situation. And this is something that has begun to happen since the government took over humanitarian distribution or humanitarian dispatch for what appears to be most of the Northwest zone. And everything started coming in piecemeal, information started coming in piecemeal. And this is one step down for the humanitarian response, which was already hindered by the fact that it's always difficult to get information. It's always difficult to mount like a region-wide response. What they're talking about here, particularly without basic services, fuel, regular supply, resupply, and everything. But now to add on top of that numbers that you can't trust and numbers that are not credible being mixed in with data that is somewhat more credible is a very difficult challenge. And what I'm afraid is that if the government is able to take over more of the humanitarian distribution, what they're going to be doing is pushing that complete isolation of that's been happening in the Western zone for the past 2 years. They're going to start pushing that east. And so, losing touch with, I mean, of course, Northwest zone is already under a internet blackout, communications blackout, but there has been humanitarian accessibility when there's fuel, when there's food to dispatch. It would be heartbreaking to see another zone go into this, ambiguous state where you can't trust the information coming out of it, and very little information is coming out at all. And so it's particularly difficult with the Northwest zone because this was one of the real ground zeros of the famine. This was where, and it appears to still be happening from reports today, there was significant looting, significant destruction of like farming equipment, stuff like that. A lot of these are farming communities. It's been difficult for them to get back on their feet. And as soon as aid was available for the first time in the past year and a half, it's now off limits again. And it's just heartbreaking to see. And this is 1 week after, I mean, the data that we have now is a week old. And so it's a week after the implementation agreement in Nairobi. It's a week after the second promise of unhindered humanitarian access, and we're still not getting it. It doesn't take this long to get unhindered humanitarian access, for this to be left to the resources and the abilities of the humanitarian agencies to respond rather than their ability to get authorization for one truck or the other. Things are very challenging, and we're sort of at a wait and see because there's just no good information really to draw out of it.
Thank you, Duke, for that. And hopefully our viewers will get more detailed update on the Tigray humanitarian update that Duke does regularly on UMD Media. Great. Zariun, once again, welcome to UMD Media's H panel. And as I mentioned in the introduction for our viewers, Zariun is in the political household, in the media household. He the household name in Ethiopia. So it's my great pleasure he was able to join us today. So what was the highlight for you? This is your first session, but what stood out for you over the past 7 days? I guess you are muted. Let me just unmute.
Oh, okay.
Now you are back. Yeah.
Okay. First, thank you for allowing me being here and for allowing me with such a distinguished panel of individuals that I do admire personally and probably share intellectual proclivities and whatever, political and otherwise. Well, Ezekiel, has repeatedly said during his different interviews, and I also heard Duke say a couple of times about it, and some other colleagues or friends, or be known or unbeknown to us. Ethiopia post 2018 has kept us surprising each and every day, and not only every day and each and the passing minutes. So, I mean, I really get confused to say and pick that I picked this or this stood for me. But in lieu of our projected discussion that's we are in, and I'll rather focus on what Iskil mentioned and what Duke mentioned, because I want to highlight how the discursive space, the media space, and the agenda setting in present Ethiopia is still APP dominated. Not only APP as a political entity or group, but PP that predominantly follows a man, an individual, a prime minister for that matter, who thinks that he's the people, he's the party, and he's Ethiopia. So, Iskil mentioned about the atrocities that has been going in Oromia and have got much more pronounced now with what I believe is a diabolical reading of the current peace process in Tigray by Abiy Ahmed and his cohorts, which is that siege and an incredible, humanly unimaginable proclivity, not only proclivity, but also embrace of destruction, pays a political dividend in advancing one's not only political traction, but political sustainability. Hence, what I believe is happening in Oromia is an extension by design, or to some extent default, of the current state that we find the conflict in northern Ethiopia, and particularly Tigray. For Abiy and his likes, the peace or the silencing of the gun. We heard about the humanitarian situation, which is not going anywhere yet. But the silence of the gun, the fact that the TPLF, more not only true to the spirit, but more true and unbelievably a convert to the spirit of the Pretoria and post-Pretoria Nairobi Agreement, trying to realize the agreement is the different situation, etc., including disarmament. The reading is that siege works. Whether he can carry this template into Oromia, which I believe he has the intention, the desire, but not the relative success he might have seen in Tigray, because Oromia is too large. The Oromos have, an incredible, not only tradition that is similar to the Tigrayans, but also a resource-supported tradition of withstanding such. So he's going to carry that. And Duke mentioned about the humanitarian delivery, what went in, what was promised, and the drip style of even those things that are arriving currently in Tigray. And look at the silence of the media, the Ethiopian media. Look at the silence of the activists that we have seen at the forefront during the heydays of the war in Tigray. Two things are there. One, war, as Ezekiel mentioned earlier, is the preferred orientation, lingua franca, dispensation of the current ruling political elite and those acolytes that we find around that system. War. Two, the discursive space, the media space, the narrative construction, deconstruction, focus, everything. Its level, its gauge, everything, its tone is being controlled from Arat Kilo. Arat Kilo being anywhere that Abiy desires it to be. It could be in what you call, what's that place, Getachew in Asmara? The presidential area. At the Harlow. It could be anywhere. So, given this, and in fact, we're going to come into the discussion of the promised reform, a political appraisal of that. What we see is we're not out of the woods, not only out of the woods. I don't think there is a political partner in and around Addis and around Abiy and around the media landscape that we wish might have helped deliver Ethiopia and Ethiopians out of this quagmire for some time to come. We might not be able to see that. That, for me, was shockingly, even though, I had suspected that, premonitions, blah, blah, blah. But when sometimes the same thing comes probably every day unabated and kicks you on the face, you certainly find, again, surprised. So I'm surprised, I'm concerned, I'm really worried that despite the much celebrated and probably much needed vis-a-vis the people of Tigray, respite and silence of the gun, and given the things that are going in Oromia, and the fact that everybody in the media and the activists and everyone is trying to put them under the carpet, the near future is not holding a good omen to us. That is what stood for me this week.
Okay, thank you, Zario. Let's go directly to the topic. So, taking stock of the 2018 promise of reform through a political lens, that's what we'll do today. And I just want to kickstart with political highlights for me in terms of what might set the discussion. So, our viewers would remember April 2018, Abiy Ahmed took office as a prime minister, and the same year, October, EPRDF's maybe last Congress occurred in Awasa, and then a couple of commissions the same year in December established: the National Reconciliation Commission, the Administrative Boundaries and Identity Issues Commission, and then a year after, in December, the same month, Nobel Prize to the Prime Minister, this prize, and the Prosperity Party established. So EPRDF gone. And then in 2020, September, Tigray regional election occurred, war on Tigray in 2 months, November 2020. June 2021, Ethiopian national election, and then the same year, December, the last month of 2021, National Dialogue Commission established. And this month, just last month, November, Pretoria Agreement signed. That's what I saw, what happened in terms of political highlights, but you can add to that as well. So let's go to Scale and, you have been very actively writing. Actually, we did a program with you in terms of 2016, 2018, Oromia protest, Cairo protest, that led into Abiy Ahmed coming to power. And we have this topic, we didn't say it reform, we said promise of reform. Maybe you can speak to that as well. So what is your appraisal of what happened in 2018 and thereafter? Let's go.
Yes, there was a promise of reform. And at the time, we actually studied political transitions. I studied political transitions in what is known as the third wave of democratization, to use Samuel Huntington's characterization. So we knew what facilitates successful democratic transition and what actually militates against it. But over the last, just to sum it up, over the last 3 years, Ethiopia has moved from that hopeful moment of a democratic transition. And I might add there that the quest for democracy was not something that started with the protest movement again under the EPRDF. It is what started in the wake of the 1960 revolution, or the attempted coup d'etat, and the subsequent development of the Ethiopian student movement. So that quest for democratization had that moment of hope, a hopeful moment that this time, at long last, that it would succeed. But instead, we have come now to the precipice of a failed state, or probably a failed state in Ethiopia. I think it is the result of the combined effect of the turmoil caused by mismanaged and derailed transition, democratic transition, and the impact of the protracted state-sponsored conflicts, which includes the Tigray civil war, but not limited, by any means not limited to that, and the chaotic mismanagement of the political space, the supposedly enlarged political space, led to extremist forces, counter-revolutionary, counter-reform forces to capture the federal government and then turn back the progress that the Ethiopian nations and nationalities had achieved or have made, the progress that they've made over the decades. So basically, from that moment of political transition, we have now moved to a failed state, which is really on the verge of disintegration because of what I said. There is really nothing to latch on. Your hope this time that the country could hold together, that the center could hold together, regardless of the Pretoria Agreement on cessation of hostilities or the Nairobi protocols on the implementation of the cessation of hostilities, regardless of the fact that the guns have fallen silent in Tigray. The underlying political problems that actually led to the conflict, the civil war in Ethiopia, have not been addressed. And I don't think the Prosperity Party is ready to do that. Keep in mind that the Pretoria Agreement with the TPLF, or the Tigray government, did not address the political issues. There were principles that everything would be resolved according to the Constitution. They didn't even say the 1995 Constitution, that's the Ethiopian Constitution. That except that promise that the Constitution would probably be invoked and enforced, the political issues, the political, ideological conflict, the border conflicts, the underlying political differences within Ethiopia have not been addressed so far. And they are unlikely to be addressed in the context of Abiy Ahmed's, what is it called, the dialogue, the national dialogue. For me, the problem is not that all of these political problems cannot be resolved through negotiating or through a national dialogue. The problem is Abiy Ahmed. It's the personality of Abiy Ahmed. It is the aspiration of Abiy Ahmed that is at the center of the cause itself. Look, all of those differences that we have, whether Ethiopia should be democratic or autocratic, or a federal unit or a unitary unit or a centralized power or decentralized power, all of these are political problems that reasonable human beings could find a solution for, compromise on it, find a solution, and address the concerns of different interest groups in Ethiopia. The reason why we are in a civil war, and as I said, the northern front, all is quiet on the northern front, but not anywhere else. That is because Abiy Ahmed believes that he is capable of sufficiently demonizing his opponents, particularly the nationalists like the TPLF and the OLF, that he would be able to demonize them sufficiently in the eyes of their respective constituencies, that he could deploy the military and other security apparatus of the state, the Ethiopian state, to do his own biddings and demoralize and terrorize the Oromo, the Tigray, and other people who actually believe in the federation, that he could terrorize them into submission, and that he believes that he could disperse financial largesse to buy off the elite of anyone. So the moment of democratization is now replaced by autocratization not because of the structural factors that usually lead to conflict, but because of a choice, because of the agency of the man that made the choice of using of militarizing the society, commercializing politics, and autocratization of decision making. So as long as that is in place, the hope that we will return back to the hopeful moment of 2018 is very unrealistic.
Thank you, Skell. Duke, I don't know if it was about that time when you were in Ethiopia, but maybe from afar, how was your reading back in 2018 and the year that followed, all that promise, and many people from Magala to Adama to Gondar, you name it, everyone was hoping good times are coming. Actually, there was a poll, a very rare poll done by one of the newspapers. I think it was Admas, if I remember it right. And it was showing Magala actually was one of the highest approval rate, if you will, for the prime minister when he came to office. Then what unfolded is the subject matter of today. So what was your reading April 2018, the years before, maybe after that, Duke?
Yeah, it's I was in Ethiopia in 2019, and that we would be having that we would be framing the discussion that we're having today like this is like, the worst outcome that people were not expecting at that point. In 2019, there was a lot of optimism. People were talking about, Ethiopia's opening the society, they're, taking off some of the restrictions on different things. There was supposed to be social reform. There was progress. I was specifically there on a research trip we were looking at religion and religion's tolerance and intolerance and stuff. And there was activity on those fronts. There was, they had reconciled the Ethiopian Orthodox and the diaspora Orthodox, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly from back then. They were trying to put together the Majlis that had, fallen under or was created under, government control and stayed that way for a while. That was supposed to be open. And there was a lot of optimism, and that was supposed to be the reforms, and not just those. I mean, there were others. I'm sure I'm less familiar with economics and stuff, but there were economic reforms, there were legal reforms that were promised. But that was supposed to be what we're talking about today. That was supposed to be the thing that was keeping the PP administration going 2 years down. I mean, I guess back in those days, the PP hadn't been created yet, but that was what was supposed to keep it going. Now, we weren't supposed to be talking about whether, and it was, I think that was brilliant analysis that the war in Oromia, it seems like the PP needs the wars to go on to continue popularity and, to keep the public in Abi's corner. Because if you recall, right before the war in Tigray, there was, some of the goodwill was wearing off in the public, or from what I heard. I remember in the West, they loved Abi. It was the young reformer, like for a while they loved the crown prince of Saudi Arabia. They fell in love with Saif Gaddafi for the same reasons. It was going to be a young reformer that was going to maybe do it the rough way, but was going to figure out how to make things better. And the novelty of that sort of wore off in Ethiopia, it seemed like, before it wore off in the West. If you went to, I was talking to a very specific population while I was there, but if you talk about, Abiy winning the Nobel Prize or some of these, compliments or praises that he got for the West, people were not terribly happy with it. So it's like night and day. It was an exciting time. I thank God that I was there for 2019, when there were still these hopes that these things were going to come around, that things were going to happen. And we should have known at that point that this wasn't going to go the way it was planned, because there was already, in Oromia, there was already authoritarian tactics being used to suppress civilians in Oromia. And this was sort of overlooked as, there were troublemakers. Jawar was trying to cause problems or something like that. I mean, we were looking at it like trying to get in the way of this great rolling, reform machine that was just going to take Ethiopia to the next level, and that there were spoilers. Instead of looking at why there were problems, instead of looking at how there were going to be pitfalls to this reform agenda, which I'm not sure if the PP is the first administration in Ethiopia to fall under this sort of conundrum of, you've made these promises, now how to deliver. And it just, everything sort of fell off the table. I had to leave when COVID broke out. I came back to the United States, but by that time there was already less optimism. There was already less planning going on, more people just waiting to see. It was a very difficult time when I was talking to a colleague of mine, and we were trying to figure out which elections were going to be the worst, if it was going to be the US election or the Ethiopian elections that were going to have the worst toll on the people. And it's still, I think the jury's still out a little bit in a very sad way on that. So yeah, I mean, the reforms, the promised reforms, they started happening, but things just sort of fizzled out. And I think that people are having a hard time coming to terms with that, particularly in the West, that we're not going to be able to go back to 2018. We were talking about national dialogues back in 2018. It would have been maybe a good idea back then. Now, Abiy is the wrong person to get this done. There's just, I mean, in my opinion, there's just no goodwill to all of the things you need. There's a lot of things you need for national dialogues to succeed, and there's a lot of things that can make them fail, like what happened in Yemen, other countries. There are more factors that could make it fail now, and very few reasons to believe that it would succeed, but they're going to try it anyway, I think.
Thank you, Doc. Zariun, I think you had a unique position in terms of media as well as political commentary, analysis. At that time, you were on the spot, so to speak. So what was going on at that time, and when did you had to stop the media activity as well at some point? And when did you see things turn from promise of reform into where we are now, even way before the war on Sudan?
Oh God. Well, sometimes when it's both comforting and discomforting when you speak with the benefit of insight. Yes, I was there. And in fact, prior to 2018, as a person who owned a media and as a person who often appeared on different mediums, including that of mine, we have tried several times to point out how things were going really, really bad. That the ruling coalition itself is completely engulfed in this confused yet persistent inner desire for change, and yet a move towards both internally and externally induced state capture. And as both Duke and Scale and you, Getachew, and others now know, because we have heard it from the very architects of that process. Yes, there were this parallel, but which I can't even call parallel, but sort of symbiotically related, feeding each other, desire for change and unbridled, both externally induced and internally triggered state capture. Why I'm calling it state capture? Because what we have come to witness after the 17-day long EPRDF Central Committee, blah, blah, Congress, with a sort of an EPRDF that finally faced itself to have no choice other than choosing the one choice, Abiy Ahmed. Now, I mean, conspiracy theories notwithstanding, there are several internal justifiable factors that showed the decadence, the level of decadence within the then ruling coalition, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front. Yet again, with a twist of irony, notwithstanding that kind of internal strife, blah, blah, everything. At the final day of the conclusion of that meeting, which ended up in electing Abiy Ahmed to become the chairman of the EPRDF. And so immediately, or mutatis mutandis, as they call it in the legal field, to be the next prime minister of Ethiopia, Abiy displayed this incredibly soft part of him in which he cried. I mean, literally cried, telling those that tried to criticize him as being not EPRDF enough, not a truly revolutionary democrat, not truly a developmentalist oriented state would-be leader. And so he won it. I'm coming to this point because Iskil mentioned beyond structural issues and institutional dysfunctionality, the one prism that probably might help us understand why the promise is not kept and why the promise turned it into a nightmare is the very choice of Abiy Ahmed and the choices of Abiy Ahmed. So, as Iskil put it, we have that, like, the 3Ds that followed immediately. Demonize opponents, deploy the military, demoralize and destroy nationalities and everything. Now, when we talk about this, Duke also mentioned, in 2019, Addis Ababa, which I was there, which I was observant of, though silent by then, because I knew how things were, turning up and going. Many who tried to put, a cautious note or a sort of just a very positive, cautious optimism in handing over our hope, our trust, our aspirations in silver platter to Abiy Ahmed and the new ruling clique that he brought together. They were called troublemakers. In fact, that's a very, very softy, very considerate way of putting it. I mean, people would go and say, "Oh, what? Oh, you? Oh, so a man of history years, because they are going, now let's come forward. Probably I might come to it later. And I'm saying this just out of the cuff, not based on a well argued, researched, blah, blah stuff. But the political insertion of Abiy into the power seat of Arat Kilo, the way he tried to consolidate that power during that transitional period, and the way he's trying to sustain that continuity of his own Nugus and Agastawi sort of imperial ascendancy bears a sort of parallel with what transpired during the transition from Emperor Menelik to Zodi II, whereby you have the coming into the scene of the progressive, the then modernizer, Prince Tapari, who had at one point tried to put his head down so that Emperor Zodi II and those around her might notice him and then cut him short of his ambition, and as well as to sort of outdo his quintessential palace competitor, Liji Yasu, on the other hand, and later on, through the process, from the modernizing progressive prince, for which not only the new reformist, then progressive, quote unquote, educated elite brought its support around, as well as the then superpowers of the world are tried to embrace, and his transition to an absolute monarch that we saw until the 1974 revolution came to undo it. So I will come why I'm saying that, because the question of choice that is getting raised is not only a choice of Abiy himself, it is his choice, but he made that choice a choice for the ruling elite that he brought together. In fact, I call it, he made it a Hobson's choice that led us to where we are now. A Hobson's choice that led us to a Hobbesian nightmare we are now in. I'll come back to that.
Thank you, Zarion. Yeah, Scale, I just want to share with our viewers what you wrote in December 2019. That is, 1 year and few months after the Prime Minister took office. And there, in the title, you say mismanaged transition, the anatomy of Ethiopia's mismanaged transition. So that's December 5th, 2019 on Addis Standard. One wonders what made you use even a mismanaged transition already then, because the West, Washington, Ottawa, Brussels, sometimes even now, after 2 years of war in Tigray and in Oromia still continuing, they use, there is a reform that could be salvaged, that could be rescued still now. So, but you already wrote about mismanaged transition and its anatomy in 2019. Took out there.
Well, I think I remember tonight Duke saying that I wish we knew. Yeah, that piece, and there are two other pieces that I wrote about the transition itself that was reversed, and this was the last actually. I wrote pieces before this one. Yeah, this is I borrowed the concept from Antonio Gramsci, and it's a dangerous interregnum. In fact, what I wrote at that time, the EPRDF was still alive. What I wrote at the time was that there were some symptoms of morbid transition, or a transition that has gone awry. The EPRDF under Abiy had already become anti-democratic. The prime minister himself had lost control of the dynamics of change internally, knowingly or unknowingly. The military was playing an outsized role at the time in maintaining law and order. There was no political negotiations. It was just calling on the military to put out fire here and there. And the security forces had begun using threats, intimidation, extrajudicial killings. I even quoted in that piece at the time that in the 2019 report, the Freedom House on the state of freedom in the world had ranked Ethiopia as not free. So that was clear of what was happening on the ground. But simply from the natures the nature of democratic transitions. As I said, since 1975, we've learned quite a lot. And I was looking at a lot of things that were really going the wrong way, in the wrong direction. The first one is Abiy Ahmed's rejection of a roadmap. In a period of transition, when the old hadn't died and the new hasn't emerged, in between and betwixt, those are dangerous moments. Even physics physics abhors vacuum, and that's the same thing with politics. So many implored the prime minister to convene the major political parties to design a roadmap that would guide the reform effort and the behavior of politicians and the code of conduct for them. Otherwise, that this transition would fail. The prime minister's response at the time was that he said he would be the bridge that would ensure the successful transition. When the calls for a roadmap increased, he actually dismissed the idea of a roadmap, saying that the roadmap has no meaning in political economy. I was hearing that, and when political transition is described as has no place in political economy, what do you make of that? Is that knowledge? Is that understanding the process? What do you make of that? If it's not political economy, what is it? So it was clear when you did not have a roadmap and you make yourself actually the bridge that would ensure the transition, successful transition, that by centralizing power you could actually bring about democratization didn't make sense at all at that time. And secondly, always historically, when there is a moment of transition, the old guard that had lost power would always connive and work hard to come back to power. That's what happened in the 1848 revolution in Europe. That is what happened in the late 19th century. That is what happens. They don't give up power. In the Ethiopian case, it was democratization that was taking place, and democratization by its very nature is the redistribution of power, and that threatens the old guard, the entrenched power, and they will do anything to return to power. So if you were a reformer, you will guard against that, but it was clear. It was clear that after he came to power, the political forces that were for and against the reform swapped places. The forces of the counter-revolution captured the reins of power at the center and banished the actual forces of change back to the periphery. They were pushed to the margins, including the Gero. They were criminalized. So it was clear that when the forces that should have been at the center to carry out the reform were banished and the counter-revolutionary forces returned, the business elite, the political elite, they bought their place at the table. So if you look at that, it was absolutely clear. And thirdly, there were a number of strategic blunders. But one of the things that one should have understood at that time is that the Abiy administration was supposed to be a caretaker or a transitional government. By that definition, there were limited issues that it could have done. It was supposed to simply carry on the routine governmental services to the public, and then preside over, not lead it, but preside over the political forces in pushing the reform process forward. This meant some reforms that would lead to the democratic election, the first democratic election that would ensure the peaceful transfer of power to whoever wins at the time. But instead, you were showing here the Medemir book. He was going to great length to change the political discourse. He was writing a book to change the ideology to what he called the homegrown ideology. Who asked him to do that? There was no demand for a homegrown ideology. he was changing the philosophy of the development state that was working very well for the Ethiopian economy at the time, and he was allowed to do that. And that he really started to take measures that should have been taken by a democratically elected government was being taken by him, and the forces of democratization retreated, and it was clear in December 2019 that the democratization had been reversed, and the process of autocratization that we see right now was already taking place. So, I mean, it's the effect of the failure of reform and the ascendancy of the politics of restoration in 2019 that indicated to me in writing that piece that the democratization had failed, and we were really going down the precipice of conflict. It was clear at that time.
Thank you, Scott, for that. One thing that is also discussed in this panel before, specifically by you, Scale, was how the personality of the Prime Minister has been always a big factor in all this. So he mentions some people, some groups are the positive forces in the reform at one time, and at another time he dismisses them, even accuses them of just anti-reform and so on. This is what he said just within months after he came to power.
እኔ መራው ድርጅት ኢህአዴግን በሚመለከት በእኔ እምነት ኢህአዴግ በከፍተኛ ደረጃ ተለውጧል ወይም በለውጥ ጉዞ ውስጥ ይገኛል። ለምሳሌ የዛሬ ዓመት ገደማ ለቀናት እጅግ አታካች ውይይት፣ ክርክር፣ ንግግር በመናደርግበት ሰዓት ሐሳቡን የማይቀበሉ ሰዎች የዲሞክራሲ እርሾ በውስጣቸው ባይኖር ኖሮ የትኛውንም ሐሳብ በማፈን ነገሩን ማስቀጠል የሚያስችል ጉልበት ነበራቸው። ነገር ግን አሁን የምናጣላቸው ቢሆኑ ለሐሳብ ልዕልና ተገዝተው በብዕርና በንግግር ብቻ ብዙዎች መሳሪያ የታጠቀ ወታደር ማዘዝ የሚችሉ ሰዎች ጭምር በብዕር ታዘው ለዲሞክራሲና ለኢትዮጵያ መቀጠል ሁሉም ነገር እርግፍ አድርጎ መተዋቸውን መዘንጋት ተገቢ አይደለም።
This is the Prime Minister talking apparently about TPLF, and he's mentioning, I don't know if you followed the subtitle Duke, where he was saying that they had the power, the gun, the army, everything to undo the reform, but they chose to, in a democratic manner, to be part of all this, and so on. So, I mean, looking at him and the perspective of people in the powers to be in Washington, Brussels, including the Nobel Peace Prize Committee, they saw in this man, in this Prime Minister, a change that would, benefit both the domestic and the regional, all that, and so on. So, other person interested in peace will have a topic on that in terms of upgrading the reform from peace and security, but you can connect the politics that was playing out after the Prime Minister came to office. Brooke.
Yeah, it was interesting because while I was there, there was a period of courtship of the TPLF when the Prosperity Party was forming, when he was trying to get everybody in the same space. And I remember reading a English language newspaper in Addis, I forget specifically which newspaper it was, but it was talking about, there was an interview he had given where he was praising the TPLF, where he was praising the organization that he was later going to call terrorists and go to war against. But it was certainly a very delicate time. I think from the outside perspective, which I can only speak on, just to as a part of my awareness there, is that from the outside perspective, it appeared to seem like the obstacles that were in Ethiopia's way, because I'm not sure if everybody was looking at it as being in his way or being in Ethiopia's way. But if you look at the obstacles, people were talking about, there were a lot of cleavages in society that could, create spoilers for progress, everything. But there was the idea, and this is very ironic, but there was this idea that Abiy was a guy who could bring people together, who could get people to sit down at the same table, and who could, get people to reconcile, to look for, and so that was, I think, surprising to some, to see that what happens on the other side of that. What happens if his overtures are rejected, if things don't go his way? And I think you also see this in other young leaders around the region, around the world, where there's a lot of promise, but people don't think about what happens when it doesn't go away. And just to go back to the comparison there with the Saudi crown prince, which of course is a completely different context, but you look at within a little bit of time, you saw what happened. You saw what happens when they are defied. You have the royals in the prison, in the Ritz-Carlton prison or whatever. You have there's a siege on Yemen, on central northern Yemen. There are he's carpet bombing Yemen. This was the crown prince, not Abiy Ahmed. Abiy Ahmed was writing letters to Yemen, but he was, you saw that there was a lot of optimism about him that people held on to, I think, because people in DC sort of attached their reputation to it. Like the Nobel Committee attached their reputation to Abiy. And a lot of people, I think, in Washington and in the State Department, I was there to interview essentially conservative Muslim leaders. And the way I would do that normally would be to, any recording that was done or anything would be encrypted. There was a disreputable journalist that got caught, tried to get, recordings out of Addis, and they got spilled to the media or whatever. But, everything's supposed to be encrypted. You take a lot of security measures when you're in a country that has a sort of repression. And people were telling me, no, it's fine. It's open. Everything's great. I mean, they had really staked their reputation on the fact that Abiy is this breath of fresh air, and is sort of ignoring the fact that, wow, it seems like he just consolidated all the parties into one. And it seems like all of his major rivals became terrorists overnight, or that this wasn't going to be the democracy moment that people thought. I think that people had a hard time acknowledging that. I think that they had a hard time coming to terms with that. And I think that, not to assign too much influence to that, but I think that played a negative role in how these things worked out. Because if you saw, every misstep that Abiy made was explained away in the West, was he was trying, the West had his back. I mean, there's so much animosity right now between Ethiopia, the West, between Abiy supporters particularly, and the West, that it's sort of hard to reconcile with what the West was doing back then, which was making excuses for what appeared to be, really bad signs that things were falling apart. Some of the stuff that Professor Esker was talking about. I mean, these things, they could have seen those as easily as anybody else. But I don't think they had eyes to see. I don't think they wanted to see that there were cracks in the armor there. So I think that the West played a bad role through this sort of I hate to compare it to, like, the sort of participation trophies that people get in early grades now, instead they've graduation, celebrating minor victories as if they're major developments, and ignoring major issues as if they're minor developments. I think that the Ethiopian people were ill-served by the international community for their devotion, I think, to Abiy Ahmed. And I think that devotion, I think that they're trying to actually sort of renew that devotion now, even after so much has happened, that you wonder, like, what could he possibly do to be considered, just completely off the rails on the wrong side of this. And yeah, I think that was it. That the way the West looked at that, the way the West sort of helped him along, I think that was a destabilizing factor in what was happening in Ethiopia.
Thank you, Duke, for that. We are going to the final section of the session, and I know it's a very broad topic, but we have a few minutes left to wind up. So the final thoughts. Hezkel, you talk about, even today you mentioned, and yesterday there was a big, maybe 2 days ago, this Twitter space where you talk about commercialization of politics in Ethiopia. Part of the problem people are worried a lot is even the opposition parties, what would otherwise would be checking the government to account in terms of what it's doing or what it's not doing, are also part of the problem these days. Maybe with that, and if you speak to that, as well as your final thoughts for the day. Scale.
Sure. I think I mentioned it here today that the civil war around the country could have been avoided. It could have been avoided. So the explanations that people give about structural factors, while they have always been there, it was not necessary to resort to the military. But it is what Abiy believes. That's what his maybe that's what his prophets tell him, that you will never be defeated. Whether he believes it or is persuaded by his prophets, the issue is not about the structural factors, it's about the agency. And that's basically what I mean. And what I say about militarization of politics, commercialization of politics, autocratization of governance, some of those observations were made by people like General Zadkan. When he met him, that's what he told him. That's what he wrote in his book Irkab and Member, that you could buy off anybody and you could suppress anybody, is his belief. He repeats that. He had said that to me. So that is the issue. What I'm driving at is that as long as you accept Abiy Ahmed as a responsible leader, there will be no solution in Ethiopia. He is probably unable to help himself, unable to control his impulses, and unable to control his own aspiration to become a transformational leader in Ethiopia. And look, all of these things are really pounded into his mind and his cohort by this diploma mills in Ethiopia, such as the International Leadership Institute, where he got a degree in transformational leadership, that you could become a transformational leadership, not understanding statecraft, not understanding Ethiopian history, not understanding the psychosocial formations within the country. So when Westerners actually believe that because of his youth, that this would be a fresh political dispensation in Ethiopia, is really erroneous. Youth is young and restless; they're not settled ones. But the youth itself, to bank on that itself, that's when we went wrong. Or judging the success or failure of politics using the yardsticks of measuring politics in the West and applying it to Ethiopia is another problem. The creation of the Prosperity Party was the biggest fiasco. EPRDF, for all its failures, the nations and nationalities of Ethiopia, or that make Ethiopia, had a forum to debate. Even though they were created by the TPLF, they ironed out their differences by debating within the EPRDF in that forum. That forum was removed when the Prosperity Party was created. The culture of the EPRDF of evaluating their leaders and removing those that are not performing was destroyed. So that is a momentous decision that actually put Ethiopia on the trajectory of conflict. Now, looking forward, the effect of the failure of reform and the ascendancy of this politics of restoration has been really, really devastating for Ethiopia. Since Abiy came to power in April 2018, the regime has committed massacres in Oromia, against the Sidama, the Benishangul Gumuz. I don't think people anywhere have suffered as much as the Qamant people. Massacres everywhere. The nations and the nationalities of Ethiopia have never witnessed such a level of state-sponsored criminality in history, not even under the conquest of Emperor Menelik. Under this regime, or the regime itself, has meticulously planned and executed the plan to assassinate several high-profile politicians, and there is no follow-up. There is no justice for them, including Simanyo Bakala, General Saara, General Gezai Abraha, Dr. Ambacho Mekonnen, Achalo Hundesa. I can go down the list. People who were murdered under this government, and there is no accounting for what happened to them. Moreover, forging an unholy alliance with a foreign power, the Ethiopian regime has unlawfully extended its power beyond the expiry date of the election and violating the constitution in October 2020. Then what came to power through this election, and I'm just don't have enough time to talk about the war itself, since we have already talked about it. What we have in Ethiopia right now is that Ethiopia is led by a person accused of committing war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, and possibly genocide. This is a prime minister who invited foreign forces, Eritrea to name it. Why I don't even know why I'm using their terminology in the peace agreement that they wrote. The Eritrean government, a foreign government, into Ethiopia to commit atrocity crimes against his own compatriots, and allowed the violation of the country's sovereignty. Ethiopia, he has already made Ethiopia an international pariah. Foreign governments should have had, Western governments should have had, and investors should have had a very difficult time dealing with a man who's accused of heinous crimes, but they are. And what I just said is a fact that the charges are still there. Now, Ethiopia is also today governed by a national government that was produced by an election that excluded Tigray on account that the region was unstable, and the entire opposition in Oromia. What kind of national government could be accepted that excludes a whole region of people? What kind of government violates the constitution willy-nilly, the constitution that gave it power and stays in power? That is what we have found. There is no, the democratization failed in 2018 before it started in earnest. And the death and the dislocation and the mayhem is just beyond measure, beyond imaginable for me. But Ethiopia is still led by the same person, and the entire West and everybody else is willing to continue to do business with him. For me, and this is what I've repeatedly said, the issue is that the man is sick. And there is a psychiatric issue. Many leaders around the world and in history have suffered from psychosomatic disorders. And the destruction that they caused, like Idi Amin, Jean Bedel Bokassa, or Nero, or others, is unbelievable. And today, when we know that there are people who suffer from psychosomatic disorders, have caused a lot of destruction, we're still allowing this to continue to happen.
Thank you, Scale, for that. Zariman, I will come to your final thoughts. What we see on the screen is the establishment of these two commissions in 2018, and nobody knows where they are. And after that, another commission, the National Dialogue Commission, is established. These are just highlights, maybe some other ones, committees, advisory councils, a number of them were established. And some people are saying he establishes these kind of commissions just to gain something out of them in the immediate term, and then nobody would remember them and so on. So your thoughts on that? And also, Scale mentioned about people, high-profile people killed, but there are also high-profile people who are sidelined. From Lemma Megersa to Gerdu Andargacho, actually, it used to be Team Lemma, and we know he's outside, but he's no more in the political landscape of the country and so on. So, what is your reading of how he does this and all this establishing commission after commission, committee after committee, but nowhere to be found?
Thank you, Getachew. I mean, both my both the panelists put it beautifully. I mean, to put it what Isgail has eloquently described and what my other colleague in the panel added, the problem with Abiy is he believes and he thinks that Ethiopia begins with him and ends with him. There is no in-between. The in-between is an aberration, something that has to be dealt away with. If we go back, today you showed me an interesting article from Awate about the three legs stool. Where are they? The two are no more. One was Lama Magarsa, the other was Abiy Ahmed. What Abiy did with the aspiration of mostly the youth from the south, the larger Oromia Gero, all the way down to Sidama and Somali, aspiration for an incremental change, a more inclusive democratic federalism, and a complete antithetical imperium narrative up from our Amhara elite brothers. He tried to lump these two together and make himself a vehicle of deliverance. But the problem is not only that the two cannot fit in together, but the very structure of power, the very constitutional foundation of that power that endowed him with that seat and that he came eventually to embrace, is categorically opposite to this actual or imagined desire and aspiration of Abiy Ahmed, who was literally trying to maintain an internationalist federal state based on a totalitarian imperial ideology and an imperial power structure, a structure where a very few would call upon the military, the higher echelons of power, and etc., etc. And that being Abiy and Abiy alone. So, what came out of it? Unable to settle this, both at the discursive level and in the practical day-to-day running of the state, as well as in shaping and developing a policy framing that the actual yearning of reform called for, which, as Iskeel mentioned, he said, I'm the roadmap. Wait, what do you need? So the easy escape that he found was to put himself with all the mystical stuff that he was mentioning. And he said, oh, come on. You see, this country's thing is unsolvable. So here, I'm God ordained to be that man, the Messiah, to bridge this chasm and take Ethiopia to his imagined land of prosperity. So Abiy is for me a man like in La La Land, I mean, with due respect. And probably that one is better. At least you don't have this actual prices that you pay in the lives of your youth, your women, I mean, your relationship with each other. I tell you, given the level of disarray that we see among the rank and file political elite around him, given the total capitulation of the loyal, quote unquote, political opposition, given the total fascistic embrace and irrational exuberance of most of our academic elites, stopping Abiy Ahmed requires many Ethiopians take the unwanted way of facing him at the arena he thinks he boards well, which I think he will not board well. So, yes, he might probably buy time with the current ongoing ceasefire in Tigray. I don't think and I don't believe, as Zerion, that he's sincerely committed to that peace agreement, unless and otherwise he declares a complete unconditional divorce with a man who has ransacked his own country and the dreams of successive generations that since he came to power, Isaias Afwerki, unless he does that in public, not behind closed doors. And not only in public, unless he does that in practice. I tell you, the Ethiopian nightmare will continue. The drones that are killing the children, the mothers, fathers of Oromia will go on to visit Amhara and might return to Tigray. And if Ogaden says no to Mustafa, then it will be next in line. And what is that? And what that pictures gave us an inferno that we call Ethiopia, but we sadly have to stand for. That's what I think.
Okay. Thank you, Zariun, for the final thought. Duke, the final word is yours today.
All right. The phone is about to die, so I'm gonna be quick here. It's difficult to follow what both panelists were saying because you guys put it so well. What we have going forward, in my mind, is that we're in a very bad spot because of a lot of things that have happened over the past 2 years and a lot of things that have been happening for quite some time before that. Namely, one of them is the Western perspective on things and how the West uses influence in Ethiopia and in other countries. But there's a real challenge of how does Ethiopia move forward as a country, like, as you know, in a post-conflict situation, to reintegrate Tigray back into Ethiopia, and possibly an Ethiopia that's very different from the one that left, and that they're also going to have to be feeling the brunt of the economic mistakes that were made over the past 2 years, and the damage to Ethiopia's reputation is going to be felt by Tigray. It's going to be felt everywhere. There's the political, I mean, not the geopolitical capital, the international goodwill, all of those things, they are now very much, I think, centralized where they are positive for Ethiopia. They are centralized in this faith in Abiy Ahmed, which is misplaced. I think any rational person might read from the situation is misplaced right now. It seems that once again we're standing with the regime against the people of Ethiopia. It's been many countries that we've done this with, to our regret, eventually. And to understand how this is going to move forward, all the political capital that should have been earned by the reforms or everything like that has been spent. It's been wasted. All of the dividends of this great, whatever steps forward that were supposed to be taken, some of them were, some of them weren't, but all of that has already been spent. It's already been spent on killing civilians. I mean, that's been that's what has been bought with all of the goodwill, is that a lot of civilians can be killed, and the world still looks at Abiy Ahmed as sort of too big to fail, or too, they still have that optimism that won't go away. And I think it does a disservice to the people of Ethiopia. I think it does a disservice to the people wherever the U.S. or the UN or European Union, these countries that sort of influence other countries around the world. I think it does a disservice. And now you see a new wave of other influences coming in, China, Russia, not that they weren't there before, but they're sort of a resurgence in Ethiopia, and that's probably not going to go very well for Ethiopia. But Ethiopia is forced to move forward with a lot less than it had at the beginning of the war in Tigray, than it had in 2019 when people were more optimistic. Now there's less to work with. There's less goodwill. And again, there are these war crimes and atrocity crimes against humanity that are being alleged, that those don't go away with a peace agreement. You don't sign a peace agreement with anybody who's going to prosecute those. If they do, of course, that's a question mark. But there are a lot of things that the problems, the inability, what both panelists were talking about, the inability to hold Abiy accountable, any accountability, any sense of holding him accountable for what's happened in Tigray, some of the worst excesses of brutality and violence, has emboldened this sort of thing. And God forbid this happen all over the country, which it already appears to be happening in different aspects. this puts Ethiopia on a very difficult track. From my opinion, as an outsider, in my opinion, it puts it on a very difficult track to see anything positive happen out of Ethiopia. So I think that's my final word.
Okay. Thank you, Duke, and thank you everyone for your insightful analysis. And Horn of Africa, we know in the Horn of Africa we are on satellite, YASAT, with Horn Broadcasting Services. And those who are viewing us from Maqala to Addis Ababa, Asmara, the H panel will be back on Friday next week. And we'll follow auditing the 2018 Promise of Reform, Socioeconomic Lens. That will be the topic for next week. For today, I would like to thank our panelists, Duke Bridge, Darin Tashome, and Skiel Kapisa. And good night from here.
Good night.
Good night.